This is the Atari 8-bit podcast.
Hey, we had Clint Eastwood's Learjet standing by to get us there at the last minute, and we just kept telling him it will be ready for the show. And meanwhile, we're thinking, how will this ever be ready for the show? This doesn't even work in the shop.
I'm Kevin Savitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. Bill Crooks worked in the coin-op division of Atari, where he facilitated the production of Atari Games' multi-million-dollar television production facility and worked on the FireFox laserdisc arcade game. In this interview, we talk briefly about Cassie Maas, whom I have previously interviewed. This interview took place on April 17, 2015.
What kind of audience are you guys casting to?
Atari hobbyists. So a typical episode gets listened to between 1,000 and 1,500 people.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's actually about 10 times larger than the employee body of Atari when I left. 15 times larger. There's an interesting factoid for you.
I was brought in, actually came in as a consultant to begin with, and what I was tasked with was looking into the feasibility of creating video games using different technology than they had been using. In other words, not just the game board with basically small iconic figures, little 8-bit figures jumping around in a pre-built world.
So you were involved with FireFox, right?
I was involved with FireFox. Prior to FireFox, we were looking into the feasibility before we had even decided to make FireFox itself. A game had come out called Dragon's Lair, which basically ran off a laser disc. And it had some branching capabilities, but it was animated. This is long before animation engines or graphics processors were fast enough to do this thing on the fly. So, and at the time, CDs were a relatively new technology. Laser discs, as you may or may not know, are, I guess the best word for them would be pseudo-digital. They used a series of pits which were represented the image, each pixel, but it was represented not just in a strict binary sense. They had a coding system that used these pits to represent the pixels, but it still spat out an analog signal, and they used it to recreate an analog signal. So it was kind of a bastardized pseudo-digital format. And so my job originally as a consultant was to do a feasibility study, and I think they were expecting like something less than what I gave. I gave them like a 30-page report with, kind of delved into the state of the art of what's going on out there now with the hardware and what it would take to actually be able to do some branching using live video, which would be the first application of using live video in a video game. And CDs at that point were limited to doing audio only and some minor data storage, but they weren't using them for gaming yet at all. It was early on in the days. Philips had just like cleared the licensing for CDs in general, and the market hadn't quite figured out what all they could do with them other than CD audio. So all that said, I started looking into it, gave them the report, and they offered me a job on the spot. Neither of us realized, I was working, it was actually my ex-father-in-law who was a vice president at Atari of R&D in the coin-op division. And he was the one that hooked me with the thing. I had a business. I'd been in the recording industry and music industry, and still am actually. Currently on tour with Elton John and Earth, Wind & Fire and Kid Rock this year is going to be my year. But directing video, and I've been I've been a musician touring my entire life as well. So I had a school that taught audio engineering, production, and music industry, and we had 1,400 students and 27 college-accredited courses, and I was teaching that, and we were delving in video because video was relatively new in the music industry at that point. It was like MTV was just getting started, and it had never really been used in a concert setting yet. So we were teaching that, and a lot of huge industry people were on my team, and then I left there and started my own school, and I just had a baby, and my ex-father-in-law, looking out for us, as a father-in-law would do, said, "Hey, would you like to do a feasibility study and pick up some extra scratch?" So I did, and he was out of town on a business trip, and I went and submitted this directly to his boss, which was a guy named Dan Van Elderen. And Dan Van Elderen had taken a senior vice president position at Atari in charge of the coin-op division. He was basically the top dog in the coin-op division at that time. Mm-hmm. And this was just after the company had split up into a couple of different entities. Warner Communications at the time, before it was Time Warner, had bought the coin-op division. And they kept the home gaming division, but they sold off the computer division to Jack Tramiel and Company, who was a guy that started Amiga. Mm-hmm. And so, or Commodore, excuse me, not right. Amiga. Jack Tramiel started Commodore. So they sold that division off, and we tightened our belts and made a commitment to doing the coolest coin-op games ever, which of course included this live video thing. So back to when I presented my findings in this report to Dan Van Elderen, he offered me a job on the spot, and I didn't have time to tell him, well, I want you to be aware that the guy you're telling me I'd be working for is my father-in-law, and actually we share a home together. So I don't want, I didn't want there to be any nepotism, but on the other hand, I really wanted the job, so I figured I'd run it by Roy when he got back from out of town, and we'd deal with it then. And at that point, nobody gave a damn, so we moved forward on it. My responsibilities that actually caused me to be hired as a part of a 3-person team were taking the experience that I had gained designing several dozens of high-end audio recording facilities, with not only the acoustics but the space planning and all the technology installations and all of that, and bringing that to bear on a production facility to actually produce and do post-production on the video for these live video, laserdisc-based video games going forward. So 3 of us were hired, myself, a guy named Chris Crummett, who was a television engineer out of San Francisco, and a guy that had been floating around the halls of MIT as a consultant for years named Mo Shore. And Mo had done some editing, offline editing for PBS through WGBH in Boston, and he came out and went on, of course, after Atari finally went under, he went on to become one of the heads of Panavision, actually. He built a really fine career with them and with Trimble and others. But at any rate, the 3 of us built and designed and built the multi-million-dollar facility. So we were the guys that worked with the vendors that designed the television production facility for Atari Games, which was the coin-op division ostensibly. And I think the facility clocked in at under $20 million, but not by much, dollars. It was state-of-the-art. It was literally on the cover of all of the production trade magazines, production studios, post-production. We had 24-track analog audio capabilities. We had everything was completely state-of-the-art. In fact, we bought some of the first machines from Ampex, they called them the VPR3 there, which was a revolutionary 1-inch helical videotape machine. They were about, I think, $140,000 or $150,000 a piece. And all of the ones that they made, we got like 4 of the first ones off available when they became available. And all the rest were scheduled to go to the Olympics in '84. And be part of the production facility for the broadcast center down there. We were just happy, to be able to throw enough money at it to where they said, we could have 4 of those that were scheduled for the Olympics to be part of our facility. And that's kind of how it rolled. So it was a very important part. So what did you do with all the equipment? We built this facility, and I'll get to that, and it'll kind of go chronologically. So we bought this facility, and we learned all the gear because this was all state-of-the-art, brand new stuff. No one knew how to use it because it was hot off the presses. We had one of the first computer graphics workstations by a company called Quantel that was fantastic and did things that now are commonplace, with Photoshop and all that sort of thing. But back then, it required a stack of 12-inch platters and removable 330 megabyte Fujitsu drive, like dual drive packs just to operate this thing, and it ran on a VAX computer. I mean, these things they weren't inconsequential. And I think it was a $200,000 graphic system. We had one of the first ever installed. So we learned how everything worked, and then we set on the mission of designing a video game. And through the connections with Warner Communications, we found a host for that we could parlay and kind of ride on the marketing coattails of the franchise, and that was FireFox. And so there were several meetings. Clint Eastwood came down several times himself and met with us, and so that we could stay true to the storyline of the picture. And we got some footage that was actually shot from his private Lear 35 over. It was either Iceland or Greenland or a combination of the two. That was the basis for most of the running footage in the game. And then we set out on the task of figuring out how do we technically create branching options in this game. So there were several meetings going back and forth between the Netherlands and meeting with Philips NV, and we realized that we needed to provide enough options to make the gameplay compelling. Mm-hmm. We estimated that we needed to be able to jump 100 frames of video during the time of a vertical interval, which is 63.5 microseconds. Mm-hmm. So, it's 1.6 microseconds. And so, at any rate, we needed to jump that far to be able to go to alternate paths in a common timeline. So there were 11 possible things that could happen as you're flying the plane. You could turn right, you could turn left, you could go up, you could go down, and you could do those in varying degrees. So a sharp right turn would be one scenario, and that goes into another timeline that is now flying that way. And it is seamed together so that only that transition is the frames, and then we jump back to another timeline where you're just flying. So at any rate, there were 11 possible concurrent timelines going on, and we had to figure out how to edit that. So for the player that they built for us, specially designed by Philips NV and our engineers, we designed something that could jump 100 tracks or 100 frames during the vertical interval. And so now we had to figure out how do we use that in our gameplay, because it's what we told them we needed, so how are we going to actually design the game? So we did we did it like shuffling a deck of cards. We take each timeline, and at exactly 3 minutes and 18 seconds and 4 frames into the timeline, for instance, we had these 11 scenarios happen. So we do 1 frame of each of those scenarios, then go to the next frame of each of those scenarios, and as it branched off and they reconverge with the main timeline, they all maintain that timeline. So it became very
sort of four movies happening interleaved.
There were 11 movies happening.
I'm sorry, 11 interleaved.
Yes, exactly, wow. Exactly. Which made we had to actually write some code that allowed us to take our edit timelines for each one of those and then shuffle them together for us. So we didn't have to just manually go, okay, now I'm going to take, I think we were actually using 3 frames of each, then jumping ahead 33 frames, do 3 frames again, jump ahead 33 frames, do 3, that kind of thing. And so we had to figure all that out. It was quite a chore. It was very fun and very rewarding. And, of course, it came down to the 11th hour, and because this was, Atari the market was changing. A lot of capabilities of home computers, and there was a lot of excitement in affordable personal computing, and people were taking different directions on satisfying their gaming Joneses back then. So all of a sudden on the scene, you had console games pop onto the scene, and Atari, we made one ourselves. We had the VCS, the video computer system, which was a gaming system, and then that led to the 2600 Atari, which many of the listeners I'm sure would be familiar with. And meanwhile, there are offerings from Sega and a number of other companies. Sony eventually got into the act, and so those were kind of nibbling away at our market share.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, we had to be the whole company's existence relied on us being successful. So there was a lot of pressure from above, and this is at a time when, just prior to the sale to Jack Tramiel and the splitting of the sheets with the company was up to about nearly 8,000 employees. And it went down to, at its low point before I left, and I was one of the last to leave, and it was down to 90 employees. So that's a big change.
Yeah.
And they were kind of betting the farm on these laserdisc video games.
Mm-hmm.
And so came time to show the working demo at a big trade show down in New Orleans. And we worked for weeks on end to make this thing work, and it was right down to the 11th hour, and it still wasn't working. They were having software and hardware issues, and it was glitchy, and all of a sudden there was an aha moment, maybe 7 or 8 o'clock at night before the show was open, and this was the focus of our booth and our presence at this trade show was FireFox. And it was the new face of video gaming, and there was a lot resting on it. And everybody was losing their mind. And we had Clint Eastwood's Learjet standing by to get us there at the last minute, and we just kept telling him it will be ready for the show. And meanwhile, we're thinking, how will this ever be ready for the show? This doesn't even work in the shop. It's all wire wrapped together. It looked like, I don't know what it looked like. It looked like Honey Boo Boo did the main board, man. It was bad. And so all of a sudden we had an aha moment at maybe 7 p.m. They said, we got it working. Oh, my God, we got it working. And everyone's working on no sleep. I mean, we've been up for at least 3 days straight. And we all of a sudden everybody got woken up from the chairs they were napping in or wherever, and were called in to help start coding the target points on the game. Well, we weren't coders, but we learned real quick how to do this. And so you've got basically, I think there was about 8 or 9 of us that were, only 2 of which were really software guys. There were some hardware guys, and everybody was out of their normal realm, and they also working on zero sleep for that week. And we coded the game. We called the pilot who was on standby at San Jose Airport, and they have a curfew there, and after a certain time at night, and I think back then it was midnight, you can't take off without a prearranged dispensation. So at 3 in the morning or 2 in the morning or something, we went over and piled into this. 6 of us piled into the Learjet, plus the pilot and the first officer, and didn't even call the tower. He just took off. No lights, nothing. He said, screw it, we're going. It was that important. And we flew down to New Orleans, and of course, being the diligent company guys that we were, we went straight to Pat O'Brien's and got our drunk on. And so that said, we tied it on pretty well. And as the sun was coming up, one of our guys who will remain nameless now was face down in the gutter. Literally, we pounded 2 of their Hurricanes, the big giant ones that are $130 each plus a $100 deposit just on the glass they serve it in. And if you finish it in less than whatever their current time limit for the month is, wherever they set it at like 20 minutes, and whoever beats that, they reset it, right? So no one had beaten it for a while, so we beat it, of course, and there was a price to pay. And meanwhile, we're conversing with these cute girls that all happen to be LSU cheerleaders next to us. And one of us, I think it was maybe me, went and woke the pilot up and said, we're flying them to Jamaica for breakfast. We have these girls. Let's take the Learjet, And, meanwhile, we said, no, that's not going to work. We'll all get fired. We've got to be presenting this at a meeting at 8 a.m. So we went to get some breakfast across the street and try to sober up. And this one particular marketing guy who was right in the head of the mix was in a 3-piece suit still. He met us down there, and he was face down in the gutter, literally in the mud, probably having vomited on himself. And that was the image that showed up in the paper in New Orleans saying, hey, the gaming people are in town, and a picture of him in the gutter. at any rate, we did sober up. We made it to the meeting. We kind of each went on our own. I was one of the first there from that team that had just flown in and after no sleep for a week, and then thought it was a good idea to go drinking, that group. So we pulled into the meeting and were welcomed by a number of very nervous people, including John Farrand, who was the president of Atari back then. And they were just wringing their hands, all our jobs rely on this, and here's these guys that smell like they just came from a brewery tour in Kentucky, or a distillery, coming in with mud on them and looking lipstick on their face and stuff. And so we said, here it is. Here's the board, and they put it in, and it worked. It didn't initially work. Of course, there was a lot of drum rolls and gasping going on, and next thing you knew, it was up and running by the grace of God. And they had a trade show, and the game was a mild success. And unfortunately, I think it proved to be too little, too late. But after that, the industry took a turn, and those gaming systems that were nipping at our heels, combined with the newfound interest in interleaved gaming of that sort, and it parlayed into CDs and was kind of the death of that company for a while. They revived for a while. They got Namco came in and brought a little infusion of capital, and they kind of made a mark in the home gaming industry for a minute, and then of course the rest is history, and ended up in a number of buried Star Wars games in the desert of Arizona somewhere. So that is the world of Atari according to Bill Crooks. During those years, it was quite a ride, and that's kind of the chronology of it. There were some other games that we were working on during that time, and one of which was a dance game that was proposed by Mo Shore and his MIT grad girlfriend, who was also an Atari gal, and I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but they proposed a dance game branded as a Michael Jackson dance game. And so we started down that rabbit hole a little bit. Michael Jackson came up for a couple of visits to consult, and it was all very exciting. It never actually got off the ground past the design stage. But I think at that point, as I said, it was probably too little too late.
And that was going to be another Laserdisc sort of video game?
That was going to be another Laserdisc application. I proposed a golf simulator, which, in retrospect, had it happened the way that I was envisioning it with Hall effect transducers in the captive ball and that whole sort of thing. It has actually been done since then very successfully. They also went on to create a set of some driving simulators that did pretty well, and I think were sold to police departments and some military applications later that brought some coin to the table, but that was after my time there.
For the home computers, there was for a while some kiosks, in-store kiosks that used Laserdisc that interfaced with the Atari 8-bit machines. Did you touch that? Did you know anything about that? Have anything to do with that?
As I said, not long after I came into the company, there was a divestiture, and the company split into two completely separate ownerships. And that happened kind of as I was coming in. So I was there for a while as home computers were still part of Atari, but it was at its very last days. So they were already kind of taking the inventory and splitting the sheets. I was aware that they had Laserdiscs over there. We referred to ours as a quick jump laser disc that was specifically designed to jump a lot of tracks of video instantaneously without having any glitch at all.
Right.
Those weren't required for the kiosk things because it was, basically like we think of the internet with a fairly mediocre connection. It took a second. It would go search for it, and then it would show you the image that you requested. And so typically the real, and I don't want to ruffle any feathers by saying this, a lot of the big horsepower in terms of engineering minds kind of key was on the coin-op side. And I'm not quite sure why that was, but the home computer division, they weren't, and that's not entirely true. There were some brilliant guys over there maybe it's just that I didn't have quite as the relationship with them as I did with some of the guys on our side. But we had some guys that really came up with, like, one guy, for instance, is a good friend of mine, Michael McKay, who was over in CoinUp. We met back then, has gone on to do a huge career in video and owns many of the patents for Sony broadcast for some of their 3D stuff and some of their high definition stuff. I mean, there was a lot of guys like that, you know, a lot of us came to the party previously having a foot in the industry and weren't limited to, we were brought in because of that. And I used the royal we, even though I was probably the lower, you know, the less noted guy on that team. But some of the engineers, like, for instance, the guy that was MIT/Stanford audio guy that was just one of many, was the guy that was the first to postulate doing 3D audio with just 3 sound sources. And the guys that developed Fourier transforms and stuff. That's Fourier transform, which, if I'm not mistaken, was developed at Stanford. That scientist worked on our teams. You know, it was like these were big hitters, and I don't think it was quite that populated with that caliber of hitters on the HCD side. I could very well be wrong, but we had some real visionaries over on our side.
How did you know Cassie?
That's actually a pretty funny story, on or off the record. It's Cassie and I actually didn't really know each other. She worked in the marketing department, I think, prior to the sale. And, you know, I mean, it's back in the day, there was a limited number of hot blondes running through the hallways, and so let's start there. And she was also clever, which even makes someone more attractive. So she always had a good media sensibilities, as you probably got talking with her. You know, she was clever. She worked for magazines. She's done TV. She done a lot of stuff, and I'll get to that. So we kind of peripherally knew each other at Atari. I didn't really ever speak with her much, except for, hi, how are you? You know, we'd have a Friday afternoon beer bash every week, and I'd see her there. We'd share a beer once in a while, but that was about it. I was married at the time anyway, and all that, so there wasn't a lot of we didn't have a lot of camaraderie until years later. I was vice president of let's say most of the large television production houses in Northern California and some in Southern California. And one of the shows we worked on was a show called The Computer Show. It was one of the first of its kind, and it was on Financial News Network, which became MSNBC later. And she was a technology reporter on the show and ran a segment. And so as one of the directors of the show, I met her there, and we realized that we had worked at Atari together and had known each other in a previous life. And then years go by, and we got a chuckle out of that and kind of became friends, but lost touch. And then years go by, and I find myself, you know, heavily ensconced again, still in the music industry. And at this point, maybe in the mid-'90s, I had a management company and a record label, which I still have. And she was introduced to me by a mutual friend as someone who was managing an artist, and she needed some help. And so we got together, and I went, wait a minute, we know each other, and we started laughing because we just keep running back into each other every few years, like it or not. And then I helped her manage that artist for a while, and then she got into real estate, but she was still doing. She was sat on the board of a couple companies. She's kind of a mover and shaker, sharp and familiar with technology, and we're still dear friends. And for that time, it fully stuck, and we've been friends ever since.
What haven't I asked you that I should have?
How connected do you feel your fan base is, or your listener base, to this whole? Let's start with Arduino and get into the maker movement as a bigger picture. And into Internet of Things. And I'm to this day, I'm a technologist. I consult with companies like Maxim, and I started doing consulting as brand marketing guy, and it's evolved more into I actually consult with them on VLSI design and all kinds of different things, and which is not my business per se, but all those years starting back at Atari and actually long before that. My dad developed the hard drive for IBM in the 50s. It is in the Smithsonian.
I saw that,
with his,
yeah.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I've been in technology virtually my entire life. And so that kind of led me to have some sort of knowledge base that has been useful in my consulting work with companies like Maxim and some others, several others.
Mm-hmm.
But so to me as a technologist, the thing to really be watching right now is tied up in a big way with, the fact that kids are learning to code in like versions of C++ on like these small microcontroller boards and even Raspberry Pis.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of is almost a direct descendant of what people were trying to have happen back in the day with the 8-bit machine. They were trying to get that to take root, but the development platforms weren't really available to take into the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So this actually comes more under a question that I would ask your viewers is like, we all have a love for this, the roots of gaming and the roots of this technology. And the 8-bit roots are, that's like, to use an analog in recording, the guys that really still get all the Grammys are the guys that understand the old school methods. Because to understand the history and how you had to really think and be organized with your thoughts when you're coding an 8-bit process, as opposed to, say, go look at the code for Windows Vista, which is just a pile of crap. And there's code everywhere to fix the code that, because you got so many people contributing and you've got an architecture that's 32 bits or whatever it is, even not then, but 64-bit now and stuff. There's some overhead. You don't have to be as smart about, your code being clean.
Mm-hmm.
My question to your viewers is, how do they perceive, what they know and they love about 8-bit moving forward, and how does that apply to technology and specifically to young technologists going forward?
I think many of the listeners do see the Arduino movement and Raspberry Pi as a sort of new generation rebirth of what was happening in the late 70s, early 80s with Apples and Atari 8-bits and that sort of thing.
Nice.
It's a small machine that you can just a person can just sit down and learn to code or do hardware, futz with the hardware or whatever.
And both ostensibly, but
sure.
That was a thing that wasn't available back in the days of when everybody fell in love with 8-bit stuff. It's like there was no internet where you could go get a YouTube video on how to write in BASIC, or how
but
to.
You waited for the magazine to come once a month, and then you typed at the thing, or you did the hardware project, or whatever was in the magazine,
right?
And that was, or maybe there was a user group if you were lucky.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So things have certainly moved faster now because of the internet.
Yeah. Kevin, I hope I answered your questions appropriately. I'm sorry if I threw you a curve by being part of the coin-op division.
No, it's
those bastards.
My problem, not.
Hey, well, listen, I appreciate you taking the time and hope it was helpful.
It was great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, man. Bye-bye.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.